In February 2026, Brian Mast, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, stood in front of a live camera on a major financial news network and told viewers to laugh at Jensen Huang. Jensen wants us to trust the CCP, Mast said, and the legislation he was backing would give Congress a 30-day window to review and block advanced chip sales to China. On one side, congressional hawks claiming that window finally seals the export gap Nvidia has been flying through. On the other, Nvidia's chief executive, a White House framework that quietly disagreed with Mast's own party colleagues, and the argument that restriction at this stage punishes American firms without meaningfully slowing China's semiconductor ceiling. The contest runs through 3 rounds: the legal mechanics of the new oversight window, the commercial and diplomatic math of what it would actually block, and the deeper question of whether the restriction arrived in time to matter. The physical object at the center of every round is a chip called the H2O, Nvidia's China-compliant derivative, engineered to sit just below United States export thresholds after earlier restrictions hit higher-tier products. It is not a flagship accelerator. It is a compromise made of subtraction, designed to preserve a revenue line while satisfying the letter of export law. Whether a deliberately hobbled chip still provides meaningful capability uplift to China's artificial intelligence build-out, and whether Congress's new review window can actually stop it, is the question both sides are really fighting over. The 3 rounds move from the mechanism itself to the commercial logic underneath it, to the latency problem neither side fully answers. The hawks open with a structural argument that is harder to dismiss than Mast's television demeanor. Prior export control lived inside Commerce Department authority, moved on executive branch timelines, and allowed Nvidia to engineer around each successive threshold revision before the ink on the rule was dry. A mandatory 30-day congressional review window moves the veto point from a single agency to a co-equal branch of government, making politically accommodated approvals procedurally harder to grant quietly. The institutional architecture changes even if no individual decision does. The counterclaim is sharper than it sounds. A 30-day window is a pause, not a prohibition. Every previous pause in chip export history has resolved into a negotiated carve-out, a new product tier, or a license exception. The mechanism gives Congress leverage. What it does not give Congress is the technical staff, the classification infrastructure, or the interagency coordination pipeline needed to assess what a given chip actually enables before the clock expires. The bill advanced by the House Foreign Affairs Committee in early 2026, and its precise scope were still being debated at the moment Mast appeared on camera. No independent legal analysis of the window's enforceability had been publicly released. The White House's own chip export framework, issued before the congressional bill advanced, took a more permissive posture toward H2O class products, a documented internal split that Mast's comments brought into the open. Round 1 goes to the hawks on structure, with a deduction for implementation. The mechanism is real. The capacity to deploy it meaningfully within the timeline is unproven. The commercial round is where the skeptics find their firmest ground, and where Huang's public argument becomes harder to separate from strategic logic. Nvidia has disclosed China revenue in quarterly filings, and the H2O was designed specifically to preserve that line. Blocking it, the hawks say, removes the last commercially viable vector for American hardware into Chinese artificial intelligence infrastructure. That reads cleanly as a restriction with teeth. Huang's counter, stated publicly, and not only on behalf of Nvidia's balance sheet, is that blocking H2O sales pushes Chinese developers toward Huawei's Ascend line and accelerates the domestic alternative it was meant to slow. That argument is not corporate spin in isolation. It is the same case the White House's own export control architects have made internally. Calibrated access to deliberately limited hardware keeps Chinese artificial intelligence developers inside American software ecosystems, dependent on support contracts and tooling stacks that carry their own intelligence value. Cutting H2O produces a cleaner political narrative while potentially producing a worse strategic outcome. The evidence holds the tension rather than resolving it. Huawei's Ascend 910 series exists as a documented domestic alternative. Independent benchmarks comparing its performance to H2O under real training workloads are sparse and contested as of early 2026. Whether Chinese labs would accelerate toward the domestic option faster with or without H2O access is a projection, not a finding. Nvidia's own claim, That compliant H2O sales do not provide the performance headroom that earlier restricted products did has not been independently stress-tested under Chinese training conditions. Round 2 to the skeptics. The commercial argument the hawks are overriding carries a strategic logic the legislative mechanism does not answer. The third round is where the timeline problem becomes impossible to ignore. The hawks are right that the cumulative installed base of Nvidia hardware inside China, acquired across multiple product generations before successive export restrictions, represents a capability stockpile that took years to build. At scale, the marginal chip is not marginal. Stopping the next shipment matters because the last 1,000 shipments already changed the baseline. But the stockpile argument cuts against the restrictions' timing as cleanly as it cuts for the restrictions' necessity. If Chinese artificial intelligence infrastructure already runs on years of accumulated hardware, the 30-day congressional review window arrives at a moment when the dependency it was designed to prevent has already been partially established. The more urgent capability question is whether Chinese foundries, specifically Semiconductor Manufacturing International, can now manufacture Ascend-class chips at production volume. Trade press reports and United States government assessments have flagged progress on advanced nodes. Specific yield figures are not publicly verified, and no independent audit of production scale exists. The gap the restriction is trying to hold may be closing from the other direction regardless. Restricting H2O at this stage is procedurally correct, symbolically coherent, and functionally incomplete in a way that neither side has fully accounted for. The combination still matters for what remains inside the safe. The dispute is whether what remains is the thing most worth protecting. Round 3 splits. The hawks are right that marginal chips matter at scale. The skeptics are right that the restriction window may be measuring the wrong gap. The decisive question underneath all 3 rounds is institutional, not technical. The confrontation between Mast and Huang is not primarily about the H2O. It is about which American institution sets semiconductor export policy, and the fact that a sitting committee chairman chose a cable news program to publicly mock the industry's most prominent chief executive signals that the answer is genuinely unresolved. When Congress and the White House operate from different frameworks on the same product, export control loses its most important property, predictability. Chinese industrial planners do not need to defeat American export law. They need American export law to remain contested long enough for domestic alternatives to mature. The Mast-Huang confrontation, whatever its legislative outcome, is evidence that the contest is working as China's planners would design it. The case against that verdict deserves its full hearing. The congressional intervention, however undiplomatic, is exactly what accountability looks like when executive branch technocrats have been captured by the lobbying interests they regulate. Huang's access to commerce, his ability to engineer successive chip tiers that satisfy the letter of each restriction while preserving substantial capability for Chinese customers, and the White House's quiet accommodation of that engineering across multiple product cycles. These are not strategic sophistication. They are regulatory capture dressed in geopolitical language. The underlying charge Mast is making, that Nvidia's public position systematically overstates the cost of restriction and understates the capability uplift China receives, is not obviously wrong. A 30-day window that forces those arguments into a public accountable form may produce noisier individual decisions while producing better long-run policy, because it ends the quiet negotiation that has kept the H2O in production across restriction cycle after restriction cycle. Institutional fracture is a real cost. It is not automatically higher than the cost of institutional capture. But the skeptics of the restriction are right about the mechanism's limits and wrong to treat the alternative, a Commerce Department process that Nvidia has repeatedly outmaneuvered, as the stable baseline it replaced. On balance, the hawks win the optics and lose the strategy. The skeptics win the logic and lose the politics. The restriction arrived too late to close the stockpile gap, too bluntly to distinguish between capability-enabling and revenue-preserving chip tiers, and in a legislative form whose implementation timeline is shorter than the interagency coordination it would require. But the confrontation it produced, a public on-camera fracture between Congress, the White House, and the industry's most powerful voice, has handed China's planners something no benchmark can measure. Confirmation that American export control is a negotiation, not a wall. The H20 chip, a compromise made of subtraction, turns out to be the perfect emblem of a policy architecture that has always been one product revision behind. The restriction meant to end the debate about what China can access has instead made the debate louder, more public, and harder to resolve. That is the outcome China's industrial strategy needed most. The round that was supposed to stop China's artificial intelligence hardware build-out is the round that put American export policy on trial. Round 2 is the one to challenge. If you think the White House's calibrated access argument is strategically sound and Mast's position is purely political theater, make that case in the comments and be specific. Does Huawei's Ascend line actually benefit more from H20 competition keeping it honest, or from H20 absence removing the ceiling? Subscribe and turn on notifications for the next round, because this fight has at least one more hearing left in it.